the woman who stepped off the afternoon stage in Dusty Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1882, had the kind of face that made men forget what they had been meaning to say, and she carried a name that did not belong to her like a stone she had hidden inside her boot. The stagecoach rattled to a stop in front of Hollis's general store, and the dust rose in slow golden curtains around its wheels, catching the last warm light of the April afternoon. Two ranchers arguing near the water trough paused mid-sentence. The blacksmith set down his hammer. Even old Deputy Crane, who had not paid a woman any real attention since his wife had left him for a traveling medicine man 3 years prior, straightened his hat and watched from beneath the porch overhang. She was not dressed like the women of Dusty Creek. Her traveling coat was the color of deep burgundy wine, worn at the elbows but still fine, cut in the style of someone who had once known better days and still remembered exactly what they felt like. Her dark hair was pinned beneath a small hat that had survived too many miles to look entirely intentional. She carried one leather bag, held tight against her side like it contained something more valuable than a change of clothes, and her eyes moved across the town with the sharp, calculating sweep of someone who was looking for all the ways a place could hurt her. She stepped down from the coach without accepting the hand the driver offered, and she walked directly to the posting board outside Hollis's, where the employment notices were tacked in crooked rows. She read them all without rushing. A schoolteacher was wanted in Laredo. A seamstress was needed at the hotel in San Marcos. And there, at the bottom right corner, pinned with a bent nail and already curling at the edges from the wind, was a handwritten notice that had been posted by a man named Crawford at the Double C Ranch, 7 miles south of Dusty Creek. The notice said that Crawford needed a housekeeper and cook. It said the wages were fair and the accommodations were decent. It said inquiries could be directed to the Crawford Ranch or to Hollis himself. It did not say that Wallace Crawford was the most stubborn man in 3 counties. It did not say that he had buried a wife 18 months ago and had not spoken her name out loud since. It did not say that the last 2 women he had hired had lasted a combined total of 11 days, because running a working cattle ranch in western Texas was not a gentle occupation, and the man who ran it had lost the ability to make things soft for anyone, including himself. She stood there reading that notice for a long moment, and then she reached into the small travel purse at her wrist and drew out a folded piece of paper. She unfolded it carefully, read what was written on it, and folded it back up. Then she walked inside Hollis's general store and asked, in a voice that was quieter than most people expected from a woman who looked like her, to speak with Mr. Hollis about the Crawford position. Her name, she told Hollis, was Clara Merritt. She had worked as a cook and housekeeper in a boarding house in Abilene for 3 years. She had a letter of reference from the proprietress, a Mrs. Ann Whitfield, that spoke very highly of her character, her work ethic, and her cooking. Hollis read the letter while she stood there, and he said it all looked fine and that Crawford would be out Friday morning to pick up supplies, or she could take the mail wagon out to the ranch tomorrow if she did not want to wait. She said she did not want to wait. Her real name was Sadie Rhodes. She had been born in 1858 in a place she had spent most of her adult life trying to get far enough from that the distance itself felt like healing. Her mother had died when she was 12. Her father had been a man who drank his wages and his goodwill in equal measure, and had eventually run himself into a debt so deep with the wrong kind of men that Sadie had packed one bag on a Tuesday night when she was 19 and walked out of their rented rooms in Fort Worth and never gone back. She had worked her way across Texas in the years since, picking up what employment she could find and setting it down again, whenever it became clear that the men who employed her had expectations that went beyond the scope of the posted position. She had cooked and cleaned and mended and hauled water. She had been a laundress and a seamstress's assistant, and for 6 months in San Antonio, a genuine boarding house cook whose biscuits were discussed with great reverence by the men who ate them. She had been careful, she had been quiet, she had saved what she could. And then, in the fall of 1881, she had made one large and terrible mistake that was not entirely her fault but had her name attached to it regardless, and a man named Derek Holbrook, who was a banker and a liar and considerably meaner than he looked, had decided to ruin her for it. Holbrook had accused her of stealing from him. The accusation was false. She had been working in his household as a cook and had witnessed something she was not supposed to witness, and his response to being witnessed had been to preemptively destroy her credibility before she could use what she had seen. He had filed a complaint. He had spread the story through every boarding house and employment office in San Antonio. Her name, Sadie Rhodes, had become something that doors closed against. So she had done what a desperate and intelligent woman does when the world will not let her keep her own name. She had borrowed one. Clara Merritt was a real woman, a friend Sadie had made and lost touch with years before, who had died of fever the previous summer in Abilene. Sadie had heard about it through a mutual acquaintance and had written carefully for several weeks before admitting to herself what she was considering. The letter of reference she carried was not forged in the sense of being entirely invented. It was written by a woman who had genuinely known Clara Merritt and had genuinely thought well of her. Sadie had altered it only slightly. The name on it was Clara's. The words were real. It was the woman holding it who did not belong. She told herself as the mail wagon bumped its way south through the mesquite and the red dust of the Texas plain that it was a temporary arrangement. She would work. She would save her money. She would find a way to clear her name with Holbrook, or she would find a way to get so far from San Antonio that it would not matter. She was not a thief. She had never been a thief. The truth of that lived in her bones even when the paper world around her said otherwise. The Double C Ranch came into view just as the afternoon was softening toward evening, and Sadie's first impression of it was that it was large and functional and almost aggressively unglamorous. The main house was a two-story structure of limestone and cedar, the kind of building that had been put up with the intention of lasting rather than impressing. There were outbuildings, a barn, a bunkhouse, fencing that went on until it became part of the horizon. There were cattle visible in the south pasture, a dark moving mass of them in the golden light. There were 2 horses tied outside the barn, and a dog of considerable size and doubtful disposition watching the wagons approach from the middle of the yard. A man came out of the barn as the wagon stopped. Later, Sadie would have difficulty explaining exactly what she noticed first. It was not any one thing. It was more like the way you notice weather, the whole impression of it arriving before you can name any single component. He was tall and rangy in the way of men who have spent years working outdoors, broad through the shoulders, with a face that had been weathered to something honest. He was perhaps 30, maybe 31, with dark hair beneath a battered hat and eyes that were a complicated shade she could not name from that distance. His shirt was rolled to the forearms, and there was dust on everything about him, which did not diminish him in the slightest. He looked at the wagon, and then he looked at her, and something happened in his expression that was not quite a frown and not quite the absence of one. It was more like a very slight and involuntary sharpening of attention, the way a man looks when something does not fit the picture he had arranged in his mind. His name was Wallace Crawford. He was 32 years old. He had built the Double C with his own hands and his father's land grant, and 12 years of brutal, consistent work. He had married a woman named Ellen at 25, and had loved her with everything he had, and had watched a fever take her from him 18 months ago, in October of 1880, and had not yet found any reliable way to stop loving her, even though loving a ghost was about as practical as trying to rope the wind. He had posted that notice for a housekeeper, because the ranch was running well but the house was not, and because his ranch hand Denny had gently but persistently suggested that a man could not live on coffee and hardtack indefinitely without consequences. He had not posted it because he wanted company. He had posted it because a functioning ranch required a functioning household, and he was wise enough to know that wisdom. He had expected, in a vague way, a woman of a certain unremarkable practical type. A widow, perhaps, someone competent and unobtrusive. What stepped down from the mail wagon was not that. She was younger than he had expected, perhaps 23 or 24, and she was prettier than was strictly convenient, and she was looking at him with eyes that were dark and intelligent and very slightly too careful, the way eyes look when they are working harder than they are letting on. Something about that careful look caught at him in a way he could not have articulated to anyone, least of all himself. He told that feeling to mind its own business and walked forward to meet her. "You're from Holly's," he said. "Yes," she said. "Clara Merritt. Mr. Holly said you needed a housekeeper and cook." He looked at her for a moment that lasted just a beat longer than social convention strictly required. "I do," he said. He did not offer his hand because he was wearing work gloves that were not clean. "Wallace Crawford, the house is this way." He showed her the kitchen first, because it was the most important room. It was a good kitchen, large and well-stocked, with a cast-iron range and proper shelving and a work table that was scarred but solid. She looked at it with an expression that he read, without knowing how, as genuine pleasure beneath the professional assessment. "It's a well-kept kitchen," she said. "I've been trying," he said. "I'm not much of a cook." "What have you been eating?" "Things that don't require much in the way of effort." She turned from the range and looked at him directly, and again he had that sense of something running just below the surface of her expression, a current that the visible surface of her face was working to contain. "I can fix that," she said. He showed her the rest of the house. The parlor that had not been properly dusted since winter, the small room at the back that would be hers, the upstairs where he slept, and where there was a second bedroom that had been his wife's sewing room and which he did not mention. He introduced her to Denny, his head ranch hand, a bow-legged man of 50 with a sunburned face and the disposition of a cheerful turtle, and to two younger hands named Pete, and a Mexican boy named Tomás, who was 19 and spoke English with a careful precision that suggested he had worked very hard to acquire it. She shook hands with each of them and remembered their names, which Denny later said to Pete was the sign of a woman worth keeping around. That first night she made a meal out of what she found in the kitchen, which was not much, but what came out of it was a venison stew with dried onions and cornbread, and when she set it on the table and Wallace sat down to eat it, he was quiet for almost a full minute, which Denny recognized as an excellent sign. "Good," Wallace said finally. "Thank you," she said, and the word was simple and without performance, and that simplicity made it mean more than it had any right to. She cleared the table and washed the dishes and went to her room, and in the quiet of that small room with its one window looking out at the dark Texas plain, she sat on the edge of the narrow bed and let herself feel the full weight of what she had done. She had taken someone else's name. She had walked into this man's house with a lie pinned to her chest like a brooch, and the house was solid and the man seemed decent and the ranch was real, and the lie felt heavier now that she was inside it than it had felt from the outside. She told herself it was temporary. She had told herself that before. She did not sleep well. The following days established a rhythm that was, on its surface, entirely professional and practical. She cooked 3 meals a day. She cleaned the house with a thoroughness that gradually revealed it had once been very well cared for, surfacing good furniture and nice curtains beneath the accumulated neglect. She found a kitchen garden behind the house that had gone to weeds and began, on her own initiative and in the afternoons when the big work was done, to reclaim it. Wallace noticed the garden. He came around the corner of the house one afternoon 4 days after her arrival and found her on her knees in the dirt pulling up the previous year's dead stalks with a focused ferocity that made him stop walking for a moment. "You don't have to do that," he said. She looked up at him. There was a smear of dirt across her cheek, and she did not appear to know it was there. "It'll give us tomatoes by July," she said, "and there's a good space for beans along that south fence." I'd like to plant them if it's all right with you." He looked at the garden and then at her. "It's all right with me," he said. He meant to walk on. He had things to do always, an endless procession of things that a ranch requires, but he found himself not walking. He found himself crouching down near the edge of the garden bed and picking up a clod of earth and breaking it open the way a farmer checks his soil. "My wife planted this garden," he said. He had not meant to say that. He was not sure what made him say it. She went still for just a moment, not a dramatic stillness. Just a brief pause in her work that acknowledged the weight of what he had said. "Then it deserves to be taken care of," she said quietly. He looked at her again with that same involuntary sharpening, and then he set the clod down and stood up and walked off toward the barn, because the barn was where he understood what was expected of him and why. Inside, he stood with his hand on a fence rail and breath through his nose and told himself that she was the housekeeper, and the housekeeper was an employee, and that was all there was to it. Ellen had been gone 18 months, and he still dreamed about her sometimes, and he was not the kind of man who made a habit of confusion about his own heart. He also knew, with the bone-deep certainty of a man who had spent his life reading animals and weather and land for signs he could not afford to miss, that there was something about Clara Merritt that was not quite what it appeared. He could not have said exactly what it was. It was nothing concrete, no slip in her story, no inconsistency he could point to. It was something in the way she carried herself, a wariness that went deeper than the ordinary caution of a woman in a new position, and the way her eyes sometimes rested on a middle distance as though she were calculating something. He did not know what to do with that feeling, so he did what he did with most feelings that inconvenienced him. He put it on a shelf in the back of his mind and left it there and went back to work. 2 weeks passed. The house became a different place. It was hard to say exactly when or how, because it happened in increments the way all real changes do. But somewhere in those first 2 weeks, the Double C Ranch house went from being a large and functional and slightly melancholy space to being something warmer. There was food on the table that was genuinely good. The curtains had been washed and rehung. The parlor smelled of the dried lavender she had found tucked into a drawer somewhere and arranged in a jar on the windowsill. The kitchen was a place a man wanted to be in the mornings. Denny commented on it with characteristic directness. "She's a good woman," he said to Wallace one evening after supper when Sadie had gone to her room and the two of them were sitting on the porch with their coffee. "She does good work," Wallace said. "That too," Denny said. He rocked in his chair once. "I meant what I said." Wallace looked out at the dark pasture and did not answer. He had been watching her, and he was irritated at himself for watching her, because the watching had an element to it that was not purely the supervisory attention of an employer. He noticed the way she laughed at something Tamaz said when she brought the midday meal out to the men working the near pasture, a real laugh that caught him off guard because he had not heard her really laugh before. He noticed that she read in the evenings when she was done with the day's work, holding the book close to the lamp with a concentration that shut out the rest of the world. He noticed that she was kind to the dog, whose name was Ridley, in the understated practical way of someone who genuinely liked animals without needing to make a production of it. He also noticed, again and again, that quality in her eyes he could not name. Not deception exactly. Something more complicated than that. Something that looked like a person who was carrying something heavy and had become very skilled at not showing the effort. On the 15th day, he came back to the house at midday to find her sitting at the kitchen table with a piece of paper in front of her, writing rapidly. She looked up when he came in and her expression went through several quick changes, none of which she had time to fully conceal. Something like alarm, something like guilt, something that settled with visible effort into composure. She folded the paper quickly and stood. "I'll have the midday meal ready shortly," she said. "I was just finishing something." "Take your time," he said, and went to wash up at the basin, and did not ask what she had been writing. because it was not his business and also because he was not entirely sure he was ready for the answer. She had been writing a letter to a woman she knew in Abilene, asking her to make careful inquiries about whether Derek Holbrook's accusation against her had been formally pursued or whether it had remained a social and professional stain rather than a legal one. She needed to know whether she was running from gossip or from something with more official teeth to it. She needed to know whether she could ever be Sadie Rhodes again somewhere that it would not cost her everything. The letter was a risk. Even writing it was a risk. She addressed it to the woman in Abilene using careful language that would not be immediately interpretable to anyone who opened it by accident or intention, and she walked to the main road the following morning before dawn and gave it to the male rider who passed through on his way to town. She felt marginally better after sending it, and considerably more frightened. What she had not fully anticipated was how difficult it would be to maintain the distance of a false name from a man who turned out to be, beneath the weathered exterior and the deliberate quietness, someone she genuinely respected. She had expected a ranch and a job and a place to be invisible for a while. She had not expected Wallace Crawford. She had not expected the way he spoke to his hands with a blunt directness that was nonetheless always fair. She had not expected to find him, one early morning, sitting with Tamaz at the kitchen table teaching the young man figures from an old ledger, patient in a way that cost him something because patience did not come naturally to him, but he had decided it was owed. She had not expected the way he handled his horses, with a quiet authority that the animals responded to not out of fear, but out of some kind of genuine accord. She had not expected, most particularly, the evening 3 weeks in when she was alone in the parlor with her book, and he came in from outside and sat down in the chair across from her not to talk to her exactly, but to be in the same room with another human being in a way he clearly needed but did not know how to ask for. She looked up from her book and he was looking at the lamp. "Do you want me to leave?" she said. "No," he said, then. "I don't get much company that isn't about the work." "I don't mind," she said. They sat in that room for an hour. He did not speak much. Neither did she. But there was something in the shared quiet that was different from ordinary silence, warmer than it had any practical reason to be. And when she finally said good night and went to her room, she sat on the edge of her bed and pressed her hands flat on her knees and admitted to herself, with great reluctance and not a little fear, that she was beginning to care about this man. She had not planned on caring about anyone. Caring was a liability she could not afford when she was living under someone else's name. The trouble with the name caught up with her on a Thursday afternoon in mid-May. It came in the form of a man riding up to the ranch, a man she did not know, who asked to speak with Crawford. She was hanging washing on the line between the house and the smoke shed when he rode up, and she watched him from behind the sheets and felt the cold hand of something undefined close briefly around her heart, because strangers who rode up to working ranches were almost never carrying news that had nothing to do with the people on them. The man's name was Alton Greer. He was a land agent from Dusty Creek who had done business with Crawford for years and who had brought papers for a grazing lease extension that needed Wallace's signature. He had nothing to do with Sadie at all. But she did not know that yet when he rode up, and the fear that moved through her in those first 3 minutes while she watched from behind the laundry was so vivid and specific that it told her something she had been trying not to know. She was not just protecting herself from inconvenience. She was protecting something she had already, without permission, started to want. She wanted to stay. She wanted to stay at the Double C Ranch, in the limestone and cedar house with the recovering kitchen garden and the parlor with the lavender in the window. And she wanted to keep cooking for this man, and sitting in the same room with him in the evenings, and watching him be patient with Tamaz and fair with Denny and honest about everything except his own loneliness, which he carried with the stoic resignation of a man who has decided that certain loads must simply be borne. She wanted to be someone he could actually know, and she was standing in the sunshine with her heart hammering at a man who turned out to be a land agent with lease papers, And she could not have told you which was more unbearable, the possibility that it would all come apart, or the certainty that the longer it didn't, the worse it would hurt when it finally did. Wallace signed the lease papers and Alton Greer rode back toward town, and Sadie finished hanging the washing with hands that had steadied themselves through sheer force of will. That evening Wallace found her sitting on the back step in the early dark, looking out at the kitchen garden where the bean seedlings had just started to show their first leaves. He stood in the doorway for a moment. "Are you all right?" he said. The question surprised her because he was not, in the ordinary run of things, a man who asked it. "Yes," she said. Then, because it was evening and the dark made certain things easier, "I had a moment today that frightened me. It turned out to be nothing." He came and sat down beside her on the step. Not close, not improper, but close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him in the cool evening air. "What frightened you?" he said. She was quiet for a moment. "I thought someone had come to take something away from me," she said, which was true, though it was not the complete truth. He nodded slowly. "That's a hard way to live," he said, "always expecting the taking." She looked at him sideways. "Have you felt that?" she said. He was quiet for longer than she was. "When Ellen died," he said, "I spent a while after expecting everything else to go too. The ranch, the cattle, my hands. Like once the worst thing had happened, the next worst thing was inevitable." He paused. "It took me a long time to stop bracing for it." She said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not either diminish what he had told her or attempt to fix it, and neither of those was what the moment needed. They sat in the quiet for a while. The stars were beginning to come out over the plain, very bright and very numerous the way they are in Texas, far from the light of towns. "The garden is coming along well," he said finally, changing the subject the way a man does when he has gone as deep as he means to go. "It is," she agreed. "Ellen would have liked that," he said, and then, as if he had surprised himself, "I don't usually say her name." "You can with me," Sadie said. "It doesn't do anyone any good to make the dead disappear." He looked at her then, fully and directly, in the way he did sometimes that made her feel as though he were reading something written in very small print. "Where did you come from, Clara Merritt?" he said. The name landed on her chest like a stone. "Abilene mostly," she said. "Before that, different places." "You don't seem like someone who's always just been a housekeeper," he said, not unkindly. More with a quality of genuine curiosity that was harder to deflect than suspicion would have been. "I've been a lot of things," she said. "The housekeeper is what I am now." He accepted this without pressing it, and the conversation drifted to practical matters. What supplies were needed, whether the south fence needed repair before the summer grazing rotation, ordinary things that made the depth of the earlier exchange easier to carry. But she lay awake that night for a long time. The answer to her letter from Abilene came 3 weeks later, on a Saturday in early June, tucked inside a larger envelope addressed generically so as not to draw notice. She read it alone in her room. The news was partly good and partly not. Derek Holbrook had not filed any formal legal complaint. Whatever he had done to her reputation had been done through social and professional channels only, not through the law. There was no warrant, no official pursuit. She was not, technically speaking, a fugitive. She was simply a woman whose name had been poisoned in one city by a man with the power to poison it. But the letter also said that Holbrook had been asking around, that he had been making inquiries through the informal networks of Texas commerce about a woman named Sadie Rhodes. That he had, according to her correspondent, been heard to say that he intended to find her and ensure she could not tell anyone what she had seen in his household. What Sadie had seen in Holbrook's household was Holbrook accepting a bribe from a land speculator to falsify a property assessment. It was fraud. It was the kind of fraud that could ruin a man if the right people knew about it. And Holbrook had decided, upon realizing she had witnessed the exchange, that the surest way to neutralize her was to neutralize her credibility before she could use it. He was still looking for her. He was looking for Sadie Rhodes. Clara Merritt, however, had not been born anywhere near Fort Worth and had no connection to a banker named Holbrook, and therefore Clara Merritt was safe. This was what she told herself, and it was true as far as it went. What it did not account for was the fact that she was falling in love with Wallace Crawford, and the mathematics of that situation were becoming increasingly impossible. She could not be in love with a man who did not know her name. She put the letter in the stove and watched it burn, and then she went and made supper, and she sat at the table with Wallace and Denny and Tamaz and Pete and ate cornbread and beans and talked about ordinary things, and she watched Wallace across the table with the ache of something she had not asked for and could not quite put down. He was watching her too, though he would have disagreed if anyone had said so. The thing was, he had not stopped thinking about what she was not saying, not because he distrusted her exactly, but because he was a man who trusted his instincts, and his instincts said there was a chapter of her story he was not being shown. He turned it over in his mind the way he turned over a difficult problem with the ranch, methodically, without forcing it, waiting for the angle of approach to reveal itself. He was not prepared for the angle of approach to reveal itself the way it did, on a hot afternoon in late June, when he rode into Dusty Creek for supplies and ran into Alton Greer outside the feed store. They talked about ordinary things for a while, the grazing lease, the summer prospects for beef prices, a road improvement that the county was supposedly planning, and that no one expected to materialize before the following decade. And then Greer mentioned, in the way of a man who is making conversation, and has no idea that a particular piece of conversation is shaped like a blade, that there had been a fellow through Dusty Creek the previous week asking about a woman. Wallace kept his expression neutral. "What kind of woman?" he said. "A runaway of some sort," Greer said. "Man said her name was Sadie Rhodes. Said she'd worked in San Antonio and had taken off before she could face some legal matter. Had a description of her. Young, dark hair, dark eyes, fine looking. Said she might be using a different name." Wallace did not say anything for a moment. "Who was the man?" he said. "Gave his name as Holbrook, Derek Holbrook, I believe, banker type, well-dressed. Did not strike me as someone I'd particularly trust, if I'm honest." "Did you tell him anything?" Greer shrugged. "Nothing to tell. I don't know any woman by that description around here." He paused. "Do you?" Wallace looked out down the main street of Dusty Creek for a long moment, at the ordinary afternoon life of the town moving past in its usual patterns. "No," he said. "Can't say that I do." He rode back to the Double C in a state of mind that was quieter and more serious than usual, which was saying something given that quiet and serious was his default setting. He thought about what Greer had told him. He thought about Clara Merritt, and the way she watched for trouble before it arrived, and the way her eyes were too careful, and the way she had been, from the very first moment she stepped down from the mail wagon, carrying something that she did not put down even when she was comfortable. He thought about the fact that Greer's description, young, dark hair, dark eyes, fine-looking, was a description that could fit a great many women in Texas, and also that it fit, with specific and uncomfortable precision, the woman currently living in his house. And then he thought about all the other things he knew about her. The way she had looked at his kitchen with real professional pleasure. The way she had set herself to the work of the ranch without complaint or negotiation. The garden she had brought back from the dead. The evenings in the parlor. The conversation on the back step where she had said it didn't do anyone any good to make the dead disappear. He put the horse in the barn and told himself he was going to find out the truth. Not because he intended to report anything to a man named Holbrook who had struck Alton Greer as untrustworthy, but because he could not keep going with the situation as it was, and he needed to understand what he was dealing with, and he needed to hear it from her. He found her in the kitchen, doing exactly what she was supposed to be doing, kneading bread dough with the steady, practiced motion of a woman who had done it so many times it had become a form of thinking. "I need to talk to you," he said. She looked at him over her shoulder and went very still in a way that told him with complete certainty that she already knew something was different about his face. She turned around and wiped her hands on her apron. "All right," she said. He sat down at the kitchen table and she sat across from him, and he looked at her for a moment before he spoke. "In town today," he said, "a man named Greer told me there was a fellow through last week looking for a young woman. Dark hair, dark eyes. Said her name was Sadie Rhodes and she might be using a different name." The color did not leave her face entirely, but it shifted, the way a landscape changes when the cloud moves across the sun. She said nothing. "His name was Holbrook," Wallace said. "The man looking for her, Derek Holbrook." She closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, they were steady and clear and very serious. "He's not a good man," she said. "I gathered that," Wallace said. "Greer said he didn't trust him." She looked at her hands for a moment, then back at him. "My name is Sadie Rhodes," she said. "Not Clara Merritt. Clara Merritt was a real woman. She died last year in Abilene. I used her name and her reference because my own name had been made useless." He waited. "I worked in Holbrook's household in San Antonio. I witnessed him accepting a bribe from a land speculator to falsify a property assessment. He found out I had seen it. Before I could tell anyone anything, he had already told everyone in San Antonio that I had stolen from him." She paused. "I had not stolen anything. I have never stolen anything in my life. But once a man like that says a thing to the right people, there is very little a woman in my position can do to say it back undone." She met his eyes directly and did not look away. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm sorry I came here with a lie. I am good at this work. Everything in that letter of reference was true about Clara. Most of it would be true about me as well, except the name. I was trying to find a place to be safe and to work and to figure out what to do next, and the Double C Ranch was the only thing that looked like it could be that." She paused. "I should have told you, I know that. I kept almost telling you." He sat with this for a long moment. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, one of the horses stamped in the corral, and Ridley the dog barked once at something in the east pasture and was quiet again. "What did you see him do?" Wallace said. "I saw Holbrook take an envelope of money from a man named Cresswell in exchange for signing a property assessment that said a piece of land along the river was worth significantly less than it was. A family named Duart owned that land. They had owned it for years, since before Texas was a state. Holbrook's assessment allowed Cresswell to force them out at a price that was a fraction of the land's value." She said this carefully, as though she had been over it many times in her own mind and had reached the point where the facts were polished smooth. "The Duart family lost their land. I saw why, and Holbrook made sure I could not say so." Wallace was quiet for another long moment. "The Duarts," he said slowly. "I knew of a family named Duart who had land along the Sandoval Fork. Lost it last year, I heard." He looked at her. "That was the land." "Yes," she said. The weight of it sat between them. Outside, the afternoon went on being a June afternoon in Texas, indifferent to the fact that something was being fundamentally rearranged in that kitchen. "Holbrook is still looking for you," Wallace said. "I know," she said. "I have a contact in Abilene who told me. He doesn't know where I am as far as I can tell. He knows the name Sadie Rhodes. He doesn't know about Clara Merritt." She paused. "Yet." He looked at her across the table. "What do you want to do?" He said. The question surprised her so thoroughly that she did not answer for several seconds. Not "what do you intend to do," not "what are you going to do," both of which would have implied she was going to do it alone. "What do you want to do?" Including, with that single word "want," the possibility that she had some agency in the matter and that the answer might be a collaborative one. "I want to stay," she said. And then, because she had decided in the last few minutes that if she was going to tell the truth, she was going to tell all of it. "I want to stay because I like this place and I'm good at this work and because I am. And I realize this is an extraordinary thing to say to an employer in a kitchen after confessing to an assumed name, somewhere considerably past simply liking you. And I know that may change how you see everything I've just told you, and you may not believe me that it's true. But I cannot be in this kitchen with you asking me what I want to do and lie to you any further about anything." The words came out with a steadiness she had not entirely expected. Her heart was hammering. She kept her hands flat on the table. He looked at her for a very long time. "I believe you," he said. "About all of it." She let out a breath. "Holbrook's going to keep looking," he said. "Yes. If he finds you here, he's going to make trouble." "Yes. And you've got information on him that could make considerably more trouble for him if it got to the right people." She had not quite thought about it this way, or she had not seen it as a resource so much as a liability. She looked at him carefully. "What are you suggesting?" she said. "I'm suggesting," Wallace said, "that a man who is willing to bribe a county assessor to steal a family's land is the kind of man who has made other enemies, and that if someone were to bring what you witnessed to the attention of, say, a federal land office or a territorial prosecutor, the matter would stop being your word against his and become something with considerably more official teeth." She was quiet for a moment. "That requires me to be Sadie Rhodes," she said. "Yes," he said, "it does. If I am Sadie Rhodes and this does not go the way we intend, I have no protection." He met her eyes. "You'd have mine," he said. The simplicity of it was what undid her finally. Not a performance, not a speech, just that, you'd have mine, as though the protection of Wallace Crawford was a specific and concrete thing he could set between her and the world, which she was beginning to understand it very much was. She did not say anything for a moment. She swallowed. "I came here lying to you," she said. "You came here running," he said. "I know the difference." She looked at him and he looked at her, and in the afternoon light of that kitchen in June of 1882, something settled between them that was as clear and solid as a cornerstone. "Tell me everything Holbrook did," he said. "Everything you saw, all of it," she told him. It took a while. He listened without interrupting, and when she was done he asked 3 precise questions that told her he had a practical, organized mind for problems that most people would find overwhelming. Then he said he knew a man, a lawyer in San Antonio who had worked with the federal land office and who was, by all accounts, genuinely honest, which was not a thing you could say about every lawyer in Texas. "His name is Fletcher," Wallace said. "Benjamin Fletcher. I've had dealings with him over a property matter 2 years back. He's straight." "Will he see me?" she said. "He'll see you if I write to him," Wallace said. She looked at her hands, which had been still through all of this and were still, and she thought about what it had cost her to sit in this kitchen and say her real name out loud to this man, and she thought about what it meant that he was sitting across from her, treating it not as a catastrophe but as a problem with a workable solution. "You're not angry," she said, "about the name." He considered this honestly. "I knew something was not right," he said. "I've known it since the first day." "And you didn't say anything." "I was waiting to understand it better," he said. "I didn't think it was malice. It didn't feel like malice." He paused. "It felt like someone trying very hard to hold something together. I know what that looks like from the inside." She looked at him. "I am going to go find Denny," he said, "and tell him we need to ride to town tomorrow to send a letter. And then I am going to let you finish making that bread because we are going to need supper." He stood up. Then he stopped. "What would you like me to call you?" She let herself, for the first time, really let herself, consider the sound of her own name in the air of this kitchen. "Sadie," she said. "Sadie," he said, trying it out quietly, as if it were something that needed to be handled carefully until they both got used to it. He went out and she turned back to the bread dough, and she kneaded it with hands that were no longer steady but trembling very slightly, though not with fear. He wrote to Benjamin Fletcher in San Antonio that week, a careful and detailed letter that did not say more than was necessary but said what was necessary with absolute clarity. He described what Sadie had witnessed, the exchange between Holbrook and Cresswell, the property assessment, the Duarte family's land. He described Holbrook's subsequent actions against Sadie. He asked Fletcher to advise on whether this was a matter that could be brought to the federal land office, and if so, what would be required. The reply came 2 weeks later at the end of June. Fletcher's letter was 3 pages long. It said that what Sadie had witnessed constituted fraud under federal land statutes and potentially bribery under Texas law. It said her eyewitness testimony, combined with any corroborating evidence, would be sufficient to open a formal investigation. It said that, critically, several other parties had made complaints to the Federal Land Office regarding assessments in Bixar County that bore Holbrook's signature, and that her testimony could be a significant and perhaps decisive piece of a much larger case. It also said, in a paragraph that Fletcher had evidently written with care, that Sadie Rhodes had no outstanding legal complaints against her. Holbrook had never filed anything formal. She was, in the eyes of the law, entirely free and clear. Wallace brought the letter to her on the back step in the early morning before the household was fully awake, and she read it standing up in the rising light, and she did not cry because she was not, under ordinary circumstances, a woman who cried readily, but she was breathing very carefully by the time she handed it back to him. "He never filed anything," she said. "No," Wallace said. "I was running from gossip," she said. "A ruin that only existed in certain rooms in San Antonio. You were running from the only thing that mattered to you, which was your ability to work and be trusted," he said. "That's not nothing." She looked at him. "Fletcher wants you to come to San Antonio," she said, "to give testimony." "He wants us to come," Wallace said. She noticed the us. She did not say anything about it, but she noticed it with the precision of a woman who has learned to notice things carefully. They made arrangements. Denny would run the ranch while they were gone. It would take 4 days to ride to San Antonio, spend a day with Fletcher, and ride back. Wallace organized the supplies and Sadie packed her one bag, and on a Monday morning in mid-July they rode out together, which was, if anyone on the Double C had been keeping score, the first time Wallace Crawford had ridden anywhere for purposes that were not strictly about the ranch since his wife had died. The ride south to San Antonio was 2 days. They camped both nights in the open, which was perfectly ordinary in 1882 in West Texas, with a fire and bedrolls a proper distance apart, and the stars overhead so large and close they seemed to be a thing you could almost reach. The first night they talked about practical things, the ranch, the hearing, what Sadie would need to say, and how she would need to say it. The second night the practical things ran out naturally, and they talked about other things instead, the way people do on the second night of a long journey when the ordinary social cautions have been worn slightly smooth by miles. She told him about growing up in Fort Worth, about her mother, who had been a schoolteacher with a genuine love of books that she had passed to Sadie like a gift, about her father and the drinking and the debt, and about the Tuesday night when she had packed her bag and walked out, which she described without self-pity but without softening it either. He listened the way he listened to everything, with his full attention and without performing the listening. "You've been on your own a long time," he said. "Since I was 19, she said. 6 years. "That's a long time to carry everything alone," he said. "I didn't know another way," she said. He looked at the fire for a while. "My father died when I was 20, he said. "Left me the land and the debts and a cattle herd that was more aspiration than substance. I didn't know how to run a ranch. I spent the first 2 years learning what not to do." "You built something real," she said. "Eventually," he said. "But for a while it was just me and the land and the cattle and a fairly direct education in failure." He paused. "I met Ellen when I was 23. She came out to teach school in Dusty Creek. She had opinions about everything and was not shy about them." Something in his face softened in a way she had not seen before, like a door opening on a room kept private. "She helped me figure out how to run a house while I figured out how to run a ranch. We were better at it together than either of us was alone." "She sounds like she was remarkable," Sadie said. "Was," he said simply. She watched him across the fire. She was not jealous of the dead woman. That would have been both petty and absurd. She was something more complicated, which was moved by the love that was still so clearly present in how he talked about her, and simultaneously aware of the particular loneliness that remains when you have been that close to someone and they are gone. "I think," she said carefully, "that being able to love someone that completely is not a loss, even when you lose them. It means you know what it's like." He looked at her across the fire. "That's a generous way to think about it," he said. "It's the only way that makes any sense to me," she said. They were quiet after that for a while. and then she said good night and rolled herself in her blanket, and he sat by the fire for a long time before he did the same. In San Antonio the following morning, they met Benjamin Fletcher in his office on Commerce Street, a broad-shouldered man with wire-rimmed glasses and the careful manner of someone who has spent years separating what is legal from what is right, and has mostly managed to keep them in the same direction. Sadie told him everything she had told Wallace, in the same careful sequence, and Fletcher listened and made notes and asked questions that were pointed and precise. He had, he told them, already been in contact with the Federal Land Office. He had 3 other complainants whose cases connected to Holbrook. Sadie's testimony would be recorded formally and added to a file that was already substantial enough to require attention. He also told her, looking at her over his glasses with an expression that was not without its own form of anger, that what had been done to her, the social destruction, the ruined reputation, the forced flight under a false name, was not unusual. It was, he said, what men with power did when they wanted to silence a witness who happened not to have power of her own. It was not right. It was, in fact, the kind of injustice that made him glad he was in the business he was in. She sat in his office and listened to this and felt something shift in her, something that had been wound very tight for a long time beginning to unknot. She gave her testimony. She signed what needed to be signed. Fletcher said the investigation would proceed over the following months and that she would likely be contacted again as it advanced. He said that based on what he knew, Derek Holbrook's position was substantially worse than her own, and that she should not expect the situation to stay unresolved for long. They walked out of Fletcher's office into the July heat of San Antonio and stood for a moment on the boardwalk. "How do you feel?" Wallace said. She thought about it honestly. "Like I have been carrying a rock for 2 years," she said, "and someone has just told me I can put it down." He looked at her. "Then put it down," he said. She almost laughed. It was so direct and so utterly him that it got past her considerable defenses, and she did laugh briefly, which made him look somewhat startled and then, in a way she had not seen from him before, genuinely pleased. They ate supper that evening in a restaurant on the river, which felt extravagant in comparison with ranch life, and which she enjoyed thoroughly. He ordered the same thing he would have ordered anywhere, something plain and substantial, and watched her enjoy the meal with the visible pleasure of a man who takes satisfaction in a simple good thing without needing to analyze why. "I want to ask you something," he said, over coffee. "All right," she said. He was quiet for a moment in the way he was always quiet before he said something that cost him something. "When you said you were somewhere past simply liking me," he said, "in the kitchen that day." She met his eyes. "I meant it," she said. "I know you meant it," he said. "I meant to tell you then that it was not unwelcome." She looked at him across the small table with its candle stub and its cotton cloth, and she felt the warmth of that simple statement move through her like the first real warmth of a long cold season. "It was not unwelcome," he repeated, as if clarifying a point of business. "I want to be clear about that." "You are very direct," she said. "I try to be," he said. "I find it saves time." "Is that what this is?" She said, "Saving time." The corner of his mouth moved, which was the closest she had seen him come to a smile that he could not talk himself out of. "No," he said. "It's me trying not to make a mess of something that matters." "And does it?" she said. "Matter?" He looked at her steadily. "Considerably," he said. She looked back at him, and it was like something that had been leaning toward something for a long time finally coming to rest. "Good," she said. They rode back to the Double C over the following 2 days, and it was different from the ride down in a way that neither of them named but both of them felt. They rode closer without thinking about it. They talked more easily. At the second camp, when the fire had burned down and she was telling him something about her mother's books, he reached across without ceremony and covered her hand with his, and they sat like that for a while in the dark without making anything of it beyond what it was, which was sufficient. When they arrived back at the Double C, Denny saw them come up the track, and something in the way they were riding side by side told him something had changed. and he was far too perceptive to pretend he did not notice and far too diplomatic to say anything about it immediately. He waited until the horses were put up and Sadie had gone inside to start the evening meal, and then he said to Wallace, "Everything go well with the lawyer business?" "Yes," Wallace said. "Anything else?" Denny said with a studiedly neutral expression. Wallace looked at him. "Mind your business," he said, but it was without heat, and Denny went back to the bunkhouse whistling. The weeks that followed were, by any external measure, much like the weeks that had preceded them. The work of the ranch continued. Sadie cooked and managed the house and tended the garden, which was by now producing tomatoes in enough quantity to do something interesting with. Wallace worked the cattle and managed the land and met with suppliers and handled the 1,000 daily problems of a working ranch. The rhythm was the same, and yet it was not the same. What changed was a kind of permission that had been granted, without ceremony, for the ordinary life of the ranch to contain the two of them in a way that was something more than employer and employee. He came to the kitchen in the evenings not just to sit at his own table, but because she was there. She left the parlor lamp on because she expected him. They talked at supper about things that were not the ranch, opinions and memories and the kinds of disagreements that reveal character. And they found, in the process, that their disagreements were mostly about method rather than principle, which is the best kind of disagreement to have with someone you are going to spend time with. In August, she asked him if she could write to her contact in Abilene and let her know that she was well and that her situation had changed for the better. He said of course, and then said more carefully that she should know the letter might be traced if Holbrook was still actively looking. "Fletcher said he expects the investigation to move quickly," she said. "He said Holbrook's position is not good." "I expect so," Wallace said, "but until it moves you're still exposed." She looked at him. "I've been Sadie Rhodes with you for 6 weeks now," she said. "I am done running." He looked at her for a long moment. "Good," he said. She wrote the letter. In September a letter came from Fletcher. The investigation had advanced. The Federal Land Office had opened a formal inquiry. Holbrook had been served with a notice of investigation. The Cresswell bribery was the centerpiece, but there were 4 additional cases now attached. It was, Fletcher wrote, unlikely that Holbrook would be in a position to cause any further trouble for anyone in the near future, and extremely likely that he would be facing federal charges by the end of the year. Sadie read the letter at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning and sat there with it in her hands for a long time. When Wallace came in at midday, she handed it to him and he read it standing up. When he finished, he looked at her. "It's over," she said. "Yes," he said. She stood up from the table. She was not entirely sure why she stood up. She just suddenly needed to be standing. 2 years, she said. 2 years of being someone I wasn't. 2 years of not being able to say my own name. He set the letter down on the table and looked at her. "You're Sadie Rhodes," he said. "You've always been Sadie Rhodes. A bad man tried to take that from you and he didn't manage it. That's the whole truth of it." She looked at him across the kitchen and something finally, completely broke loose in her, not in a sad way but in the way of a floodgate finally being opened and letting through a current that had been building behind it for a very long time. He crossed the kitchen in 3 strides and she met him in the middle, and he put his arms around her in the uncomplicated way of a man who is done deliberating, and she held on to him and let herself be held. And the kitchen was quiet, and September was outside the window making the light golden, and even through the relief, and the release she was aware, with every sensible and practical part of her, that she was exactly where she needed to be. "I would very much like," she said, somewhat muffled against his shoulder, "to stay here." "You live here," he said. She looked up at him. "I mean stay," she said, and the word meant what they both understood it to mean. He looked at her with those complicated eyes she had never quite found the right word for, and she saw in them the same thing she had been carrying since the kitchen conversation in June, and the campfire conversations in July, and every ordinary evening in between. Not just affection, though it was that, but something deliberate and decided and serious in the way of a man who does not decide things lightly. "Sadie Rhodes," he said, "I have been in love with you since roughly the third week you were here, and I have been handling it with what I believe was considerable restraint." She stared at him. "The third week," she said. "You laughed at something Tomas said," he said. "In the near pasture. I was on the other side of the fence. I could not hear what you said, but I could see the laugh, and it was—" He paused. "It was a problem for me." She looked at him and felt the truth of it land somewhere deep and solid. "I love you," she said, because she had been done pretending about anything for weeks now, and this was not the moment for false caution. He looked at her as if she had said something that required him to readjust his entire understanding of his surroundings. Then he kissed her, which he did with the same quality he brought to everything else he did, fully and without hedging. October in Texas brought the first real bite of cool air after the long burning summer, and with it, a sense of things settling into their proper shape. Fletcher wrote again to say that Holbrook had been formally charged and that the case was proceeding. The Duarte family, he noted in a paragraph that Sadie read 3 times, had engaged their own legal counsel and were pursuing a claim for the return of their land or appropriate compensation. It was not certain they would succeed, but they had a case, and that case existed in part because of what Sadie had seen and what she had been willing to say. She thought about that a great deal. She thought about Holbrook's decision to silence her by ruining her, and how it had sent her on a journey that had landed her, after 2 years of frightened carefulness and one forged name, in a limestone ranch house in western Texas, where the morning light came through the kitchen window at a particular angle that made everything look as though it had been specifically arranged for her benefit. There is a kind of justice that is not the formal kind administered by federal land offices. It is the quieter kind that happens when the thing a bad person tried to prevent ends up, through the particular roundabout logic of consequences, producing something the bad person could never have intended. Holbrook had tried to make sure she could not tell anyone what she had seen. In doing so, he had sent her to Dusty Creek, Texas, to the Double C Ranch, to a kitchen garden and an evening on a back step and a campfire in July, and a man named Wallace Crawford who had known from the first moment that she was not quite what she appeared and had decided, without ever quite articulating it to himself until later, to give her the room to be exactly what she actually was. She thought about all of this on a Sunday afternoon in October while she was sitting in the parlor with her book and he was across from her with a ranch ledger, and she looked at him over the top of her page and he was already looking at her, which was becoming something she could depend on. "What?" he said. "I was just thinking," she said. "About what?" "About how I arrived here with a forged name," she said, "and you knew from the first moment." He was quiet for a beat. "I did not know what it was," he said. "I just knew something was there. And you let me stay anyway," she said. He set down the ledger. "I watched you work," he said. "I watched you treat my hands with respect and bring the garden back and sit in this room without filling it with noise. I watched you be careful with everything, and I thought, whatever this woman is running from, it is not because of who she is. It is because of what happened to her. Those are different things." She looked at him. "I think," she said, "that you were, and this is a generous assessment, the best possible person for me to have accidentally arrived at." He looked at her with that almost smile. "Accidentally," he said. "I answered a notice on a posting board," she said. "I cannot claim to have planned for you." "No," he said, "neither can I." He proposed to her that same October, on a Sunday evening after supper, in the kitchen where it had all begun, with a directness that was entirely consistent with every other thing about him. He sat down across from her and said that he intended to ask her to marry him and that she should know it was not an impulsive thing. He had given it considerable thought over a considerable number of weeks. He was not a man who had thought he would marry again. He had imagined in the year after Ellen died that the ranch would be his whole life and that would be sufficient. He had been wrong about that, or rather, meeting Sadie had made him wrong about it, and he was glad. She said yes. She said it immediately and without hesitation, which made him look briefly startled, and then, in that way of his, deeply and quietly glad. They were married in Dusty Creek in November of 1882, in the small church on the main street, with Denny as Wallace's witness, and a woman from town named Berta Hollies, the storekeeper's wife, as Sadie's, because Berta had taken a strong liking to Sadie over the months and had told Hollies on more than one occasion that Crawford had done well for himself. The ceremony was not elaborate. Sadie wore a dress she had made herself from a bolt of deep blue cotton she had found in Hollies' store, and she wore her dark hair down for the first time anyone had seen it that way. And when Wallace saw her come through the church door, he went very still for a moment in the particular way of a man who has been taken by surprise by something he was already expecting. The minister said the words, and they said the words back, and Wallace put a ring on her finger, a plain gold band that had been his grandmother's, and that he had kept in a box in his bureau drawer for reasons he had never examined until now. They rode home to the Double C in the thin November sunshine, and Denny and the hands had hung a banner of sorts from the barn door, made from flour sacks and red paint, that said, in Tomas's careful lettering, "Welcome home." The supper Denny had cooked was, by any objective assessment, a catastrophe, but they ate it with great appreciation, and Sadie secretly resolved to teach Denny 3 reliable recipes before Christmas. That first winter of their marriage was a quiet one in the best sense of the word. The ranch settled into itself for the cold months. There was work still. There is always work on a cattle ranch, but the pace was different and the evenings were longer, and the house was warm with the kind of warmth that is not just the cast-iron stove, but the accumulated life of 2 people choosing to build something together. She learned things about him that could only be learned in the dailiness of winter quarters. He was meticulous about the ranch accounts. He woke before dawn no matter what season it was. He read whenever he had the chance, mostly practical things, ranching manuals and land surveys. But also she discovered history, which he read the way she read novels, with full attention and a tendency to come back to the table with an opinion about something that had happened 300 years ago. He made his coffee too strong and did not believe in this fact. He was not a man who talked about his feelings with any ease or frequency, but he was a man whose actions were so consistently aligned with what he said he felt that the economy of his words was, if you understood how to read it, its own kind of eloquence. She learned that she could make him laugh, which was not easy but was, when she managed it, one of the most satisfying things she had discovered about her new life. She learned that he trusted her judgment on things she had not expected him to consult her on, ranch decisions, neighbor matters, the handling of a dispute with a neighboring property over a fence line. He did not consult her because he could not make the decisions himself. He consulted her because he had found that her perspective was frequently different from his, and that the difference was useful. She felt herself, over the course of that winter, becoming something she had not known she could be. Not just settled, though she was that, but genuinely known, genuinely present in a life rather than passing through it under borrowed credentials. In February, a letter came from Fletcher saying that Holbrook had been convicted on 4 counts of federal fraud and 2 counts of state bribery. He was facing a significant prison sentence. The Cresswell money had been traced. The land assessments had been formally overturned. The Duarte family had been awarded compensation that, while not equivalent to the full value of the land they had lost, was substantial enough to represent a genuine reckoning. Sadie sat with this letter for a long time. Wallace found her at the kitchen table and sat down across from her and read it when she passed it to him. "Justice," he said. "A version of it," she said. "The Duartes still don't have their land." "No," he said, "but they have something, and Holbrook has what he deserves." She thought about the Duarte family, people she had never met, whose loss had been the original terrible consequence of what she had witnessed. There was no way to make that entirely right. There was only the fact that what had been done was now on record and accounted for, and the man who had done it would answer for it. "I spent 2 years being afraid of him," she said. "Yes," Wallace said. "And he was the one who had things to be afraid of," she said. Usually the way, Wallace said. She looked across at him. I want to write to Tomaz's family, she said. Wallace looked at her. She had been thinking about this for a while. Tomaz had come to the Double C from a Mexican family who worked a small farm near the Rio Grande, and he sent most of his wages home each month. He had told Sadie, in one of their kitchen conversations when she had been teaching him to make pie crust, that his family had once had more land than they did now, but had lost portions of it over the years to the same kinds of pressures that had taken the Duarte's land. The informal dispossession of Mexican and Mexican-American families from Texas land was not an isolated occurrence, and she knew it. I want to ask Fletcher if there is anything that can be done for families like Tomaz's, she said. I know it is larger than one letter and one lawyer, but I want to ask. Wallace looked at her steadily. Write the letter, he said. She wrote it. Fletcher's reply, when it came, was honest and somewhat discouraging about the specific legal possibilities, but it named 2 organizations in San Antonio that were working on exactly these questions, and suggested she might contact them with what she knew about patterns of assessor fraud in the region. She did. It did not immediately fix anything. These things do not immediately fix anything, but it was a thread picked up, and that matters. Spring came back to the Double C with the reliable wonder of a Texas spring, all wind and wildflowers and the sudden improbable green of the pastures after the dry months. The kitchen garden was replanted and expanded. Sadie had plans for a proper herb section along the south wall of the house, and an apple tree that Wallace said would take years to produce anything, and she said that was fine because they were staying. In April, she told him she was expecting a child. He was at the barn door when she told him. Because she had been so full of the news, she had simply walked straight out to where he was working rather than waiting for him to come in. He had been examining a fence post. He turned around and she told him, and he looked at her for a long moment with an expression she had not seen on him before and would not have known how to describe precisely, except that it contained things she recognized. The gravity of someone receiving something significant, and underneath it, unmistakably, the particular warm light of a man for whom this news was not just welcome but healing. He came to her and put his hands on her face and looked at her very carefully, as if checking that she was real. "Are you well?" he said. "Very well," she said. He kissed her forehead and then held her for a long time in the barn doorway in the April morning, and she felt the solidity of him around her and the warmth, and she thought about the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach 2 years ago with a borrowed name and a stone in her boot, watching this land with eyes that were looking for all the ways it could hurt her. The land had not hurt her. The land had given her this. Their son was born in November of 1883, a year after their wedding almost to the day. They named him James, after Wallace's father, and after Sadie's mother, whose middle name had been the female form of it. He was a substantial and opinionated baby who arrived in the world with the air of someone who intended to have extensive views about everything and would not be restrained from expressing them. Denny, who had no children of his own and had clearly been waiting for some time for the ranch to produce some, was so thoroughly delighted by James Crawford that Sadie began to suspect he would spoil the child irreparably if left unsupervised, which was a concern she shared with Wallace, and Wallace said was probably accurate, but that the presence of a delighted Denny was unlikely to do permanent damage. Tomaz, who had by this point been promoted to something close to an assistant foreman, and who was learning the accounting alongside the ranch work, looked at James with the expression of someone who intended to be the finest honorary uncle the Texas plains had ever produced. The ranch continued to prosper. Wallace's management of it was sound, and his instincts were good, and the years of the 1880s were, for a working cattle operation in western Texas, not without their difficulties but navigable by someone with his combination of stubbornness and practical wisdom. Sadie ran the house and the garden and wrote letters and read and was, without quite planning to become this, known in Dusty Creek as someone worth talking to when a matter required both intelligence and directness. She became, over time, someone the women of Dusty Creek came to about things they did not know how to address through the ordinary channels. A woman whose husband drank. A family whose water rights were being contested. A girl who needed a letter written on her behalf. She handled these things with the precision of someone who had spent years understanding the mechanics of a world that was frequently unkind to people without power. And the fact that she had learned this through her own experience rather than theory made her counsel specific and useful, rather than general and vague. Wallace watched this with a pride that he did not often articulate, but which was visible in the way he referred to her in conversations with other men. Not as his wife, generically, but as Sadie, with the particular weight of someone naming a specific and considerable person. In 1885, their daughter was born. They named her Ellen because Sadie had suggested it, and the suggestion had made Wallace very quiet for a moment in a way she understood and had intended. He had looked at her with those complicated eyes and said it was the right name. The little girl turned out to have opinions as substantial as her brothers and considerably more energy. And by the time she was 2, she was following her father around the ranch yard, with the focused determination of someone who intended to learn everything as quickly as possible. James, at 2 years old when his sister arrived, adjusted to her presence with the philosophical resilience of a child who has been raised in a household of competent and affectionate people, which is to say, he largely accepted it as a fact of life, and returned his attention to the more pressing matter of learning to ride the small pony his father had acquired for exactly this purpose. The years arranged themselves around the Double C Ranch with the solidity of good foundations. The limestone house was added to, a proper study for Wallace and a workroom for Sadie where she kept her correspondence and her books, and the growing file of papers related to the land rights work she continued to pursue through the organizations in San Antonio. The kitchen garden expanded to a genuine kitchen farm. The apple tree, which Sadie had planted in the spring and which Wallace had said would take years, did in fact take years, but by 1887 it was producing, modestly but genuinely, and the first apple from it was eaten by James Crawford, aged 4, who declared it acceptable with the air of a judge delivering a verdict. Holbrook served his prison sentence. Fletcher wrote to tell them when it concluded in 1887. Sadie read the letter and felt something final settle in her. He was out, but he was a convicted man. Everything he had tried to do to silence her had instead produced a record that would follow him. She had been afraid of him for so long that it took a while for the news of his release to stop carrying any particular weight. But eventually it did, because a man who has been stripped of his professional standing and convicted of federal fraud is not in any position to do harm to a woman who is the wife of a well-established rancher and who has her own name and her own record and 2 children and an apple tree. She was not afraid of him. She had not been afraid of anything for a long time, not in the constant low-grade way she had once lived. She had moments of ordinary human concern, the children's health, the unpredictability of the cattle market, the summer of 1886 when a drought hit the western counties hard, and they had to make decisions she lost sleep over. But fear as a permanent condition of her existence had departed, somewhere in the spaces between that first kitchen conversation and the campfire in July and the November wedding and James's birth, and it had not returned. On a September evening in 1888, Sadie was sitting on the back step in the early dark, which she did sometimes when she wanted to think or simply to be outside with the stars and the plain and the smell of the land that had become, without her planning it, her land. James was asleep inside. Ellen was asleep. The house was quiet behind her. Wallace came out and sat beside her, close in the way they sat after 6 years of a marriage that had given them the ease of people who know each other well enough to be comfortable without performance. "What are you thinking about?" he said. She considered the question honestly, the way she always did now. "I was thinking about the woman who stepped off the stage at Dusty Creek in 1882 with someone else's name," she said. "I was thinking about how she stood in front of that posting board and read all the notices and chose this one." "Why did you choose this one?" he said. He had never asked. He asked now. She thought about it. 7 miles from town," she said. "I thought if I am going to be hiding, I should be somewhere that does not get a lot of traffic. I thought a working ranch is practical and I am practical and that is a good match." She paused. And there was something about the way the notice was written, not fancy, just direct. It said what it was. "I thought a man who writes a notice like that might be someone you can work for without dreading what he actually wants from you." He looked at her sideways. "You could tell that from a notice on a board," he said. "I was not right about everything in those days," she said, "but I was right about that." He looked out at the dark plain. The stars were out in their usual extravagant Texas quantity. "And now," he said. She leaned against his shoulder. "Now I am Sadie Crawford," she said. "Who used to be Sadie Rhodes. Who once, for a few months, was Clara Merritt. Who did not deserve to have her name borrowed but who would, I think, have understood why it was necessary." She paused. "I am here and this is mine and you are mine and I am yours, and all of that started with a notice on a posting board and a woman who was desperate enough to try." He put his arm around her. "I knew from the first moment," he said. "You've said that before," she said. "You knew something was not right." "I knew something was more than it appeared," he said, which was a slightly different thing, and she recognized it as such. She turned to look at him in the dark. "You knew I was more than I appeared," she said. "Yes," he said. "I was not sure what to do with that at the time. And now," he looked at her with those eyes she had long since found her word for. They were the color of weathered cedar in the afternoon light. She had been looking at them for 6 years and they still required her full attention. "Now I think," he said, "that you arriving here with a forged name was the best thing that has ever happened to me after Ellen and the children, and I included in that company without apology." She looked at him for a long moment. "Wallace Crawford," she said. "Sadie Crawford," he said. She kissed him in the dark on the back step with the stars overhead and the plain stretching out in every direction, and the house warm and full behind them. And it was a kiss that contained, as the best kisses do, the particular richness of everything that had come before it. The posting board and the forged name and the first meal and the garden and the campfire and the kitchen table and the ring that had been his grandmother's, and the morning the letter came from Fletcher and the November of James and the November of Ellen, and all the ordinary, extraordinary days of a life that had been, in the end, more than either of them had known to hope for when they had started the unlikely business of finding each other. She pulled back and looked at the stars for a moment. "I want to plant 2 more apple trees in the spring," she said. He looked at her. "You told me the first one would take forever," she said. "It did take years," he said. "And then it gave us apples," she said. "That is the whole point." He thought about this in the way he thought about things he intended to agree with. 2 trees, he said. "And I want to write to Fletcher again," she said. "I have heard there is a case in Bixar County, another assessor, another family losing land. I think he should know what I know about the pattern." "Write to him," he said. "And I think," she said, "that Tomás should be given a formal share in the operation. He has been running half the ranch for 3 years now and his wages do not reflect that." "I've been thinking the same thing," he said. She looked at him. "Why didn't you say so?" she said. "I was waiting for you to say it first," he said, "because I knew you would and I wanted to see how long it would take." She stared at him. "That is," she said, "a deeply unreasonable way to conduct ranch business." 11 days, he said. "That's how long it took you. I've already drawn up the preliminary figures." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she laughed. The full real laugh that had once, through a fence on a summer afternoon, caused him a problem he was very glad he had decided not to solve. They sat on the back step for a while longer, in the dark and the stars and the good smell of the Texas plain in September. And then they went inside, and the house closed around them warm and solid, and full of the particular piece of people who have arrived, after considerable difficulty, and a few forged documents, at precisely where they were supposed to be. The Double C Ranch stood for many more decades after that night on the back step. The limestone house was added to again in 1892 when they needed the room. James Crawford grew up straight and capable and genuinely kind, with his father's quality of full attention and his mother's quality of noticing the things that were harder to see. Ellen Crawford grew up with opinions about everything and a laugh you could hear across a pasture, and she eventually became one of the first women in that part of Texas to serve on a formal school board, which she did with the efficient implacability of someone raised by Sadie Crawford. Tomas Reyes received his partnership stake in the Double C in the spring of 1889 and proved to be, over the following years, exactly the kind of person who deserved it. He saved his money and eventually brought his younger brother up from the Rio Grande to work alongside him, and then his mother, who cooked things that made Sadie sit down at the kitchen table and say thank you with the specific reverence of a woman who understands what it takes. Denny grew old on the Double C, which was where he had always intended to grow old, and was known to anyone who would listen as the finest judge of cattle in 3 counties and the finest judge of character in at least 2. And he claimed in his later years to have known from the very first meal that Clara Merritt, who turned out to be Sadie Rhodes, who turned out to be Sadie Crawford, was exactly what the ranch needed, which was probably more retrospective than prophetic, but was not entirely wrong. Holbrook faded from consequence. Fletcher's last communication about him said he had moved to a smaller city and a quieter life, which was appropriate and sufficient. The Duarte family's case was never fully resolved in the way justice demands in a perfect world, but their story had been told and recorded, and the fraud had been named, and the telling of it had eventually contributed to a broader legal conversation about land rights in Texas that outlasted the individuals involved and mattered in ways that are difficult to trace precisely, but are nonetheless real. 2 apple trees were planted in the spring of 1889. By 1893, they were producing abundantly, and the apples from the Double C Ranch kitchen garden became a thing that people in Dusty Creek mentioned when they mentioned the Crawford place, along with the good horses and the honest accounting, and the way Wallace Crawford stood by his word, and the way Sadie Crawford stood by everyone. She stood on the porch of the limestone house on an October morning in 1894, and watched the light come across the plain the way it comes in October, long and gold, and full of something that is not quite sadness and not quite joy, but something more like the acknowledgement of time and the recognition that time, when spent well, is not a loss. Wallace came out behind her and stood beside her with his coffee, and they watched the October light together in the way of 2 people who have watched many mornings together and know that this is one of the things a life is made of. 12 years, she said. He looked at her. Since you arrived, she said. He was quiet for a moment. You came off the stage, he said, and you looked at the posting board, and I thought that woman is going to be trouble. She turned to look at him. You never told me that, she said. I thought it in the most positive sense, he said. She looked at him, and the October light was gold between them, and the plain stretched out, and the apple trees were in the garden, and the house was full, and the ranch was real, and she was Sadie Crawford, which was not a borrowed name but her own, built over 12 years of honest work and genuine love, and the accumulated weight of every morning she had chosen to stay. Positive trouble, she said. The best kind, he said. She took his free hand in hers, and they stood in the October morning and looked at their land, and there was nothing left unresolved, nothing left unclaimed, nothing left to run from or hide behind, only the good, solid, forward continuation of a life they had made together out of a posting board notice and a forged name, and the particular grace of a man who had known from the very first moment that something more was there, and had had the wisdom to wait until she was ready to let him see it.